Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Baker Institute. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's program and our very distinguished speaker, who is going to give us a presentation on Oslo, the Oslo peace process, and after a participant's report of the peace process by Dr. Yair Hirschfeld, who is our Baker Institute Rabin Fellow. It's a very modest title. He says a participant's report, but as you've seen in your program, when you read his bio, Dr. Hirschfeld is really the academic brains behind the whole Oslo peace process. He is the man who actually formulated the concept and sold it to the policymakers in Israel, and played the critical role in this whole process and one of the most important developments in the Arab-Israeli negotiations historically. You see from the program, and I'm not going to repeat his achievements because it's all written out there, but he is the Director General of the Tel Aviv-based Economic Cooperation Foundation, co-founded with Yossi Beilin in 1990. The Baker Institute and the ECF have been working intimately over the last 2 years on Israeli-Palestinian workshop, in which we have produced a very important report in February 2003 on how to transform and translate Prime Minister Sharon's disengagement from Gaza into a viable process whereby the Palestinians can start building their statehood in the areas evacuated by the Israelis in Gaza and the West Bank, before settlements in the West Bank, both economically and in terms of security arrangements, and to build up the Palestinian Authority as a test case of Palestinian statehood, looking forward to the day when final status negotiations can be pursued by the parties. We actually had some impact in Washington, in government in Israel and with the Palestinians. When we published this report, the conventional wisdom is that each side should proceed with its unilateral obligations. We said, we didn't put it this bluntly, but this process needs adult supervision, and the United States should play a key role. And lo and behold, we started getting some reaction in Washington, and Secretary Rice appointed General Ward to coordinate the security arrangements, and Mr. Wolfenson of the World Bank to coordinate the economic rehabilitation arrangements. And in this room here, when the Israelis and the Palestinians were not speaking with one another, this is about over a year ago, we convened here at the Baker Institute a very important Israeli and Palestinian delegation with international participants, in which the beginnings of the dialogue started. And I'll never forget when it got really heated at one point. The Israelis started shouting at the Palestinians in Arabic, and the Palestinians shouted back at the Israelis in Hebrew. I stopped the whole session and I said, "There's hope. You're speaking each other's language." I recommend you read, if you haven't, the February report. I have a personal beef with Yair Hirschfeld that I have to tell you. When I was Assistant Secretary of State during the whole Oslo process, turning from the Bush administration to Clinton administration, I was in charge of the American delegation in the Madrid Peace Conference talks, and we were convened on the first floor of the State Department. And we had an Israeli-Jordanian delegation, a Palestinian-Jordanian delegation, because the Israelis were insisting that they did not want to sit down with the Palestinians alone. So we had to do this Palestinian-Jordanian delegation. And the Palestinians didn't like this at all. And we were conducting these negotiations with the Syrians, the Israelis, the Palestinians, the Jordanians. It was quite a process. One day it dawned upon me that something was not right with this picture. And I joked to my colleagues, it's on the record, it's been put in a book, but I joke with my colleagues, I said, you know, wouldn't it be something if the Israelis are dealing directly with the PLO behind our backs and we don't know it? Ha ha ha. Well, that's exactly what was happening, and that's the man responsible for it. But it was one of the most innovative initiatives ever taken, and we're really honored to have this moment whereby we can get the insights from one of the most important people in the peace process. Welcome, Dr. Yair Hirschfeld, to the podium at the Baker Institute.
Where do I push the buttons? Yeah, I see. Many thanks, Ambassador, most distinguished audience. I'm most pleased and honored to speak before you today. I've prepared a little presentation. I'll try to run through it relatively fast. I don't leave as much as possible time for questions and answers. The topic is, as you see, the Oslo process towards roadmap implementation, and I will start to try to tell you, we developed in the late 80s and the early 90s the Oslo strategy, which is in itself a two-stage approach based on the Camp David agreements that were signed in September 1978 between the government of Israel, the government of Egypt, and the United States. That first there would be Palestinian self-government, second there would be moving towards permanent status, and moving to good neighborly relations between two states. That's the strategy. From an Israeli point of view, the understanding then was, and the understanding today is, that the strategy of two states, and I'll come to it more, is the only way that Israel can maintain its raison d'etre of maintaining, being the place where the Jewish people will implement its right to self-determination and maintain a democratic and Jewish state. Before we came to Oslo, we had learned on the basis of trial and error that it wasn't easy to establish this two-stage approach. And I don't know if you remember Winston Churchill speaking about American politics, but when he spoke about American politics, he said that the United States foreign policy takes always right decisions, but only after they have exhausted all other alternatives. And you'll see that we, Israel, are following our great ally in this approach. But it is, from an historical point of view, it is something you have sometimes to go through the motion, and there's some historical logic to it that you want to find out what is the optimal you can get. So it started after the Camp David Accords with negotiations on Palestinian self-government with the Egyptian government, Egyptian delegations, which failed in January 1982. And I'll come to it immediately afterwards. I believe that failures in negotiations are historically important for the continuation, and they give some indication what can be achieved. From 82 to 88, in September, 1st of September 82, the Reagan Plan was presented to the Palestinians, Jordanians, and Israelis, and it meant to go on to this concept that had been developed on the basis of a Jordanian option to negotiate with King Hussein on doing it. There were a lot of successes between 82 and 88, but it failed finally. At the end of July 1988, King Hussein took the decision to move out of the process. And from 88 onwards, I can tell you long stories about it, the PLO became the major player. By a decision of Secretary of State Schultz, who actually prepared the ground for a US-PLO dialogue, which was started after December 14, after the PLO had accepted 3 basic preconditions for such a dialogue. And then from 1991 onwards, we went to the Madrid conference and Washington negotiations, which actually were the structure and the background for the negotiations. The Oslo negotiations took place. And the most important do and maker of the Madrid conference and the Washington negotiations was Secretary of State and Ambassador Jirijian, who with adult supervision made this possible for both sides in an enormous way, taking care of the basic vital interests of the State of Israel and basic vital interests of the other parties. Let me look quickly at the successes and failures that were got. The Israeli-Egyptian negotiations ended in no agreement. And in an American bridging proposal, which I would have rejected if I would have been in charge. But it ended afterwards that in January 1982, the Israeli government made an autonomy proposal, which I, for months and actually years, took to the Palestinian leadership in the West Bank and told them, you know, if this is the basis for negotiations, it's a win proposition for you, because the Israeli proposition is quite generous, and it leads to a two-state, in the end it will lead to a two-state solution, because if you negotiate on the basis of UN Resolution 242, which is territory for peace, there's a Palestinian self-government which is negotiating it, this will mean in the end that you can decide whether to establish a chess club on the territory will get out, or a Palestinian state. And I assume that the choice of the Palestinians will be for a state and not for the chess club. So the proposal was enormously important in preparing the negotiations afterwards. The Jordanian negotiations, King Hussein, if you remember, said, I'm willing to go to negotiations, but a Bedouin doesn't move from one place to the other if he doesn't know where he was going to go to. And the Israeli side said, we can't tell you what the outcome of negotiations are before negotiations. But then he said, we need a kind of umbrella to know where we are going. If we're out in the desert, what will support us? And what he wanted was an international conference. And actually the idea of an international conference led to the concept of the Madrid conference, which was made to happen in October 1991. But the basic negotiations for the conference had started in 87, 88, and partly also early in 90, as part of the negotiations that came out of the Jordanian option. On the PLO-US dialogue, there was no header when it started. Actually, what the United States was telling the State of Israel is, we Americans, if I can interpret American policy, we, the United States, see Israel as our ally. And we want to talk to you. And if you tell us what to do and how to move ahead, or we have an understanding what can be done, then we will work together with you. But if everything you tell us is no, which was the vocabulary then of the Prime Minister of Israel, they can be more detailed on that, then we might listen to the other side, and if they come up with some ideas, we will come back to you with them. So it put the PLO-US dialogue, put the government of Israel into a situation where it had to come up with a proposal. And the proposal the government of Israel came up was the so-called Shamir-Rabin 4 points, which were the basis afterwards for Madrid and for the Oslo negotiations. That means to work on the Camp David concept, try to get the Arab states involved, take care of social and economic issues, and speak to the Palestinian delegation in a very specific way. And then started the Track 2 dialogue with the PLO, which actually led to Oslo. Let me tell you why it was so difficult, to move ahead. The idea of Palestinian self-government was brilliant in concept, but difficult to agree on. Because Israel had a system of control over the West Bank and Gaza, which going from the Israeli control to self-government was to give up the reins, to give up control of it and not to know what's going to happen. And for the Palestinians, whatever they would receive would be too little, and it would irritate them too. So there was a break, there was an impasse, actually by definition. And we had to find out how to overcome this impasse. And another question was whether to recognize or not to recognize the PLO. If a government of Israel and Prime Minister Rabin sort of recognizing the PLO since 1989, when in the Intifada he spoke to the local leadership, they were in prison, he went into prison, he met them in prison and said, you know, why don't we get out and I take you to the finest hotel in Jerusalem or where you want and we'll negotiate. And they told him, no, not here, go to Tunis. don't want to tell you what they tell us afterwards, but at that time they told us go to Tunis. The question is, if you want to recognize the PLO, if you officially speak to the PLO, you recognize them before you know whether you can do a deal. You only can speak to them if you don't recognize them, so you have to speak to them unofficially. You also need kind of guy like me, a track 2 guy, who can actually test the ground and find out whether you can reach an agreement, and only afterwards you have to decide whether to go for the business, for the deal. And another question was how to create common language between the languages that had been so different, and so there's been such a gap between them. So these, if we wanted to look at, if we in the 80s looked at the pitfalls, at the dangers, at the reasons for failure, we had to give answers to all these 3 questions. And we actually found answers to these 3 questions to make Oslo a success. In 1990, I worked from 1979 to 1990, actually on account of my family. But in 1990, we established this ECF, the Economic Cooperation Foundation. We got the first project, and we got the project from the European Commission to develop a research piece which was called From Dependence to Interdependence. And what I did is that I looked at 3 modes of negotiations, and I interviewed 35 leading Palestinians, and I interviewed Israeli body politic, the Shamir people mainly. And I found out there was one of the concepts, models that I submitted to the people was not acceptable to the Israelis. The other was not acceptable to the Palestinians. But the principle in the middle was the principle of graduality, which I'll explain immediately, which was interesting enough acceptable to everybody. So in a way, if I get you back to the first question, if the question is Palestinian self-government, whether how to not to lose control and not to take too little, the principle of graduality gave an answer to the dilemma, that Israelis could give up control slowly and gradually, where the Palestinians would know that they would get more and more control gradually. And the principle of graduality gave an answer to the first problem. Developing the technique of back-channel negotiations emerged after from 88, 1989, 90. What happened was that from 1981, 82, I would prepare for Shimon Peres and Yossi Beilin and Naftali Blumenthal a dialogue with the Palestinian leadership in the West Bank and Gaza. And this was always me, always us asking for the meetings. When the Intifada broke out in December 88, it turned around and the Palestinians were asking to meet us. And what we developed was a 3-step approach, where I would go out and speak mainly with 2 people, with Faisal Husseini, who was the leader of the Palestinian community in the West Bank and Gaza, a wonderful man, and Hanan Ashrawi, who you may have heard of, was also a very impressive political thinker and spokeswoman. And we would try to develop in a brainstorming manner a concept how to start to negotiate. Then it would go to Shimon Peres. And at a certain stage in July 1989, we had the first concept, which afterwards became the basis for the 5 Baker points. And then Peres would take it to Shamir. And what we had developed, without being even aware of what we were developing, was a concept, a technique of back-channel negotiations, where you, under actually the direct direction of the leadership, can brainstorm academically, totally deniable, and can work out formulas that actually could be translated into government policy. So we developed this, and this gave a clear answer to the second problem. It gave an answer how to recognize and not to recognize the PLO. It made it clear that you can speak to the PLO, but don't have to recognize it, but you can actually go ahead on that. Developing the language of negotiations, there were 2 parts of it. When I did this research work in the beginning, one Palestinian, and I was quite shocked about it, gave it back to me in red ink. And I feel, to tell you the truth, I felt insulted. I'm not a little boy that you have to correct my... But in any case, what I understood afterwards, that he had given me the language of negotiations. He had given me what words can you use to make things more acceptable, the same idea acceptable to the other side. It was enormously useful. And we developed something else on the language of negotiations. I tried to explain to my Palestinian dialogue partners that they should imagine the right to self-determination as a big cupboard, as a cupboard with many, many drawers. And I told them, you know, in this cupboard, there will be one or two drawers which you will never get. There will be two Palestinian states. But for instance, if the right of self-determination means that you'll invite Arab armies to the West Bank and Gaza as a threat to Israel, you will never get that. Forget that. There are certain drawers that will always be closed. But there are certain doors we can put out. And what I actually was saying is we started to use the language of Palestinian self-empowerment. And if you read Oslo, the Oslo language, it has the language of self-empowerment, of a port authority, of a water authority. It has the language of Palestinian state building. So in a way, this gave the answer to how to create a common language. Now the principle of graduality meant actually, instead of going from the one big step that was perceived in Camp David, to go to little steps. And what I've done here is to show you actually the steps that were taken, which were quite a lot. And there have been 11 agreements signed in the Oslo process. Oslo has become the basis for the peace treaty between Israel and Jordan. But the promise was that on the 4th of May 1999, we should conclude the permanent status negotiations. And we will immediately see that we can make the success on telling what was success and failure. And there's, you see, one big point on success and 4 points on failures. My wife says I shouldn't speak about the failures, but they're an important part to understand where we are going to, and learning from the failures has an impact on what is happening today. But the big success is that Oslo conceived a two-state solution. And we said we wanted to go to end of occupation of the Palestinian territories and have a two-state solution. Now, I'll tell you the first joke I told in Oslo, the first meeting in Oslo, which actually was south of Oslo in Sarpsborg. I told my Palestinian friends, which was Abu Allah, who's now Prime Minister, I started actually with a joke, and I'll tell you the joke quickly, which says that God is asking the three most important leaders of the time, President Bush, the father, Mr. Gorbachev, and Mr. Shamir, to come to see him. And he tells the three leaders, I have to tell you something very sad. I've made a mistake. A star is going to hit the world, and everybody's going to explode, and you've got 2 more weeks to live. But you're the most important leaders of the world, so you have the right to go to your people and tell them to prepare for in these 2 weeks and make the best out of it. So Gorbachev goes to Moscow and goes on air and says, my dear Russian people, I've got 2 very bad stories to tell you. The first is we hope there would be no God, and unfortunately there is God. So that's bad. But what is worse is we're all going to die. So please prepare for it. So President Bush goes on air and says, my dear American people, a wonderful nation, I've got a wonderful news item and I've got a bad news item. The wonderful news item, there's God and we rejoice in God. And that's wonderful. The bad one is we're going to die. And then Shamir goes on air and says, my dear Israeli people, I've got 2 wonderful news items. The first is there's God and we rejoice in God. But the second one is far better. I can assure you there will never be a Palestinian state. And you know, this was the reality 92, 93. It's not the reality today anymore. Today you've got the Prime Minister of the State of Israel who speaks about the 2-state solution. You go into the settlers movement and they are speaking about the 2-state solution. I've written a book together with the former Secretary General of the settlers movement who says, let's go for the 2-state solution. And I even told the President of the State of Israel, I, Otniel Schnell, and my wife Dina are willing to get out of the place where we're living in Malé Michmash in order to make this happen. So there's been a more important progress. And the process, I would say I'm today more optimistic than I was in 1993. But let me look at the 4 failures, because the 4 failures are very important. We hoped that Oslo would create what we call in Hebrew the state in being, in becoming, the state on its way, Medina Shebaderech. And the logic of Oslo was that Arafat would permit the Palestinian government to establish a real state structure, and he didn't. He didn't for various reasons which I can explain, but it failed. There were many groups. There's all the major functions of a functioning government, functioning constitution, of a functioning decision-making structure. All this wasn't created in Oslo, and it's a major failure. And it undermined the legitimacy of both sides, of the Israeli side and of the Palestinian side, to move ahead. The second big failure was that the logic of Oslo was to move the settlements, as either to limit them or move them out as much as possible. There were 90,000 settlers in the West Bank and Gaza in 1993. There should have been 40,000 settlers in 2000, in May 1999, but there were 200,000. And you cannot expect from the Palestinian Authority to negotiate peace with us when Israel de facto is taking away land from the Palestinians. So it undermined the legitimacy to move ahead, and it created a lot of bad blood. The third failure was security. In Oslo, there was a moment when it was first the non-officials alone, and then came the Director General of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, who was seen as a Paris man, which he was. And then later came in Yoel, and in mid-June, early June, came in Yoel Singer, who was seen rightly as Rabin's man. And when he came in, Arafat sent via Abu Allah a message to Prime Minister Rabin saying, I want to make a deal. It will mean economic development for us Palestinians. It will mean security for you Israelis. It will mean going jointly together towards permanent status. And Rabin answered, sent back a message to Arafat, telling him, because you sent me this message, because it is economic development for you, security for us, and the joint negotiating process towards an agreement, I am going to conclude Oslo. And I will make the deal. And the truth is that the Palestinians, I don't want to be careful with my words, but Arafat would smuggle weapons in his cars. He would give orders to all kinds of terrible things that happened while Rabin was still alive. And after Rabin died, it was the February and March 1996 was even worse. Only in March 96, Arafat started to understand that he's to keep up his promise, but it was very, very late already, and a lot of damage had been done. And it's not easy to put the genie back into the bottle. Also, some achievements were made which are important even for today. And we obviously failed in a peaceful transition from the first stage of self-government to the second stage of permanent status. We have 5 years of intifada, of fighting each other with a high cost of blood. Now, in 1999, there was a Labour government voted in, and Barak promised to go to permanent status. And we obviously failed, and I'll be very quick on it, but I believe on both sides are to blame. More Barak on the methodology and Arafat on other things. Barak's position was, and the general thinks in these ways, and I'm happy that generals deal with armies, not always sure if they should deal with politics. Some may be quite good in it, others maybe not. But he had the concept, everything or nothing. I'll put everything on the table as much as possible, and then he either takes it or leaves it. And politics are more complicated, and I'll be more detailed about it later. It was a policy that was made to fail, and I must say we said it when it was happening. Arafat is, I'll say something nasty. In Dennis Ross's book, he says that Arafat never has a strategy. Dennis Ross is wrong, like in some other issues. The truth is that Arafat always has three strategies. I had a Palestinian friend who told me he went together with Arafat to see a leader in Africa, and he told him, you know, you always have to have 2 or 3 strategies. So I'm not taking it even from, it's not an analytical thing I'm taking it from clear knowledge. Now the 3 strategies he developed, and we were aware of it when it happened, was testing whether permanent status was doable, which was to go along with the process, to look into a Palestinian state with provisional borders with 2 years period for permanent status negotiations. At the end, after the Camp David meeting, Camp David II, in mid-August, Hanan Ashrawi contacted me, and we started to speak about the possible safety network. This story is not known. And in about the 12th or 14th of September 2000, she came with 5 handwritten pages from Arafat. And the handwritten pages from Arafat said, let's not go for permanent status. Let's go for something with less. Let me have municipality elections in Jerusalem, and let me give me another part of the territory, that I can establish a Palestinian state with provisional borders on 52–54% of the territory, and then negotiate for the 2 years. And this was handed over. Barak gave me the order. I was given the order by Yossi Beilin. Tell Hanan Ashrawi that we are far more progressed in negotiations and we don't need it. Everything or nothing. And Arafat, there was one meeting between Arafat and Barak, which was afterwards organized, and Arafat went to Barak and said, why don't you go for it? And Barak said no. And a week later, the Intifada started. And I have no doubt, and I can give you a lot of footnotes on there, I can sustain it. I have no doubt that the Palestinians did start the violence. Sharon going to the Temple Mountain gave an excuse for it, but there was Palestinian plan and was installed in order to get out of the difficult situation Arafat was in. Now let me look a little bit of the causes of failure and why I believe that that American planning for Camp David and also Israeli planning was quite a disaster. And I must tell you that on the evening when the delegations went to Camp David, I phoned my sister and I told my sister, Barak is jumping out of an aeroplane without a parachute. And these are the reasons why I thought so. There are 5 different options how you prepare for a summit. If you would go and ask Henry Kissinger, he would say any summit you go to has to be prepared, every line of it, of the outcome, the press announcement, everything ahead of time. And don't go to a summit if you don't know exactly what is happening. Anybody who remembers the meeting between President Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev in Vienna in May 1961 knows what a disaster it is if you go to a summit which is not well prepared. And it's a basic rule of behavior which you teach at the first year of political science, which I'm not a political scientist. The second rule is, if you cannot have that, maybe you don't have that luxury, you could do what President Carter did in Camp David. You have a clear concept. You've got a pre-negotiated concept, which you actually have finished with one side by March 1978. And from March 1978, you prepare the concept more and more in details in negotiations. When you go to Camp David, you have actually the concept in place, and you know exactly what the difficulties are, and you can go for the kill of concluding it. It was far away from that. It was nothing like that before that. The third rule is, if you don't have A, you don't have B, at least go for the third option, the third rule. And the third rule is, anyone who negotiated with the Palestinians would know what I'm saying here. Anyone would know that Arafat would always maintain, he would never, you can't negotiate with Arafat a deal. You could never do that. He would let Abu Mazen, Abu Allah, all the others, Yasser Bedrabo, all the different other Abus, he would let them negotiate. If there was a consensus among the supporters, this first circle, he would always ask for more. He would always make difficulties in the last 24 hours and get something more, and then say, okay, you agreed on it, I'm doing better than you. And it's similar to President Assad's, things may be a little bit different, but without the support of his surrounding, there's no way he could go ahead. we went to, when the United States went to Camp David, there had been negotiations in Stockholm which were most important than the disaster. What happened was that the Palestinian delegation to Stockholm excluded Abu Mazen and the entire coalition of Abu Mazen. And it was an Abu Allah Muhammad Dahlan coalition. And the Abu Mazen coalition, I can't tell you who, but I won't, leaked the agreements of Stockholm, the understandings of Stockholm to the press in Lebanon. And immediately the Palestinian team retracted. And then the government negotiators in Israel sent me and Nimrod Novik, who may be known to some of you, to Abu Mazen, and say, Abu Mazen, don't destroy this process. It's too valuable. Don't destroy it. And Abu Mazen told us, I won't destroy it, but give me some time. And then suddenly Barack and Clinton, I think he's a wonderful man, but the assumption is that the American government ceases to exist when he ceases to become president is an assumption which is practically, historically, hardly sustainable. And then they suddenly pushed to go to Camp David. Arafat told Madeleine Albright, don't go, we're not ready. Abu Mazen told us, don't go, we are not ready. The Palestinians went to Camp David, where the inner circle of PLO advisors wasn't there. And what you had in Camp David is that most of the negotiators actually were there physically, but were not there politically. They disengaged in the negotiations. And you cannot come to an agreement with this if this is the situation. And we knew it ahead. You have to prepare the Palestinian public to move ahead. You could learn a little bit from the South Africans. The South Africans had, before de Klerk went for the negotiations on what he was moving on, he put the right to go to negotiations on a referendum. And there were ways to do that, to put something to the vote, to have the legitimacy of the people to negotiate. And you had to prepare Egypt and Jordan in order to give support. Our people went to the President Mubarak and asked to give public support to Camp David. And he said, yes, I'm phoning Arafat. I said, no, don't phone Arafat. That's not good enough. You have to say things publicly. And he wasn't prepared to do it. And here, there was something which you had to do in order to prepare. So the third rule of doing things was not done. If you don't have the first, the second, and the third, at least have an agreed fallback. You want permanent status, everything or nothing? You may get it, but at least have something not to do it. President Clinton, going to Camp David, told Barack, you know, my fear is we may destroy Oslo. And let's see how we go to it, and the answer was no. Well, this is not to blame the American side. This was the Israeli side who actually put away the idea of a fallback that could be done. Now, the last thing, if you don't have 1, 2, 3, 4, at least have 5, have a clear understanding what is the basic give and take. Barak's understanding of the give and take is that I would give on territory and would get something on Jerusalem. And the refugee thing was agreed ahead of time, actually by Oslo, that there would be no right of return. That was not what Arafat thought. Arafat thought, I'm not going to give in on territory on Jerusalem. If you press me on the 2, I will raise the refugee thing. And what came out of Camp David were also some good things. But what came out of Camp David was that the Palestinians enormously played up the refugee issue and caused a lot of lack of security and a sense of hostility on both camps. So all this one could have known before, and the truth is we knew that before it happened. Now the lessons are important for the future. The lessons are, I would be say 5, and they're almost identical to the mistakes. Develop conceptual understandings of what may be achieved and what concessions each side has to make. We must do that in a way, and American policy can do that. We know today quite a lot. What happened after Camp David was that there were 24 sessions between Saeb Erekat and Gilad Shaer, the 2 chief negotiators. And they produced what we call an INP document. An INP document is a document where you've got the common text, but there are certain positions, Israeli positions, certain positions, Palestinian positions. And you can develop a clear understanding what this give and take has to be, and I believe this is doable today. Obtain a preliminary majority support of the Israeli and Palestinian people. You'll have elections in Israel by October, November 2006. You have the Palestinian elections, which should have been on January 25, 2006, but most likely will be postponed. You can prepare for these elections a basic understanding to get the legitimacy to negotiate. Obtain proactive support from Arab states. There's been now afterwards from Egypt, from Jordan, from Saudi Arabia. There are a lot of things one can do to do it, and this place is more capable of doing that than any other place in the world. Due to the big respect Secretary of State James Bacon and Ambassador Jerijan have in the Arab world. We can look at Israeli-Palestinian mutually reinforced legitimacy building. I don't want to take into that, but there's many ways of doing it. And develop the contours of PSA, of a permanent status agreement, which is quite close to the first. These are the lessons, and if we will do now work for the coming year on what to do. These will guide us in actually our work. Now let me take you a little what happened further. You had the Bush proposal Bush speech made in June 2002, who spoke about the vision, and then developed the roadmap. And I believe the roadmap in itself is a logical conclusion of the failures of Oslo. What did it say? In phase one, in order to start to negotiate, you have to have basic conditions in place. You have to have the functioning government for the Palestinians, you have to have security for the Israelis, and you have to make it clear that there will be no settlement expansion, there will be a settlement freeze and possibly settlement disengagement or evacuation before. To make it clear, the Palestinians have to know that you don't take away their land while negotiating with them. The Israelis have to know that you don't kill us, while negotiating with us, and you use the gun as an act of negotiations. So that's the phase one, and we're not far. I believe that we can reach phase one in the coming 4 to 5 months. This is very optimistic, but one of the things we will be planning is that the ambassador is coming out to our place, and we will speak about what can be done in order to actually move on that. The Prime Minister of Israel, Sharon, has actually said that his part of doing it, removing illegal outposts, he's willing to do. Phase two of the roadmap says if the conditions, and we have the government obligation of the State of Israel, of the Government of Israel of June 2004, says the Government of Israel, will go back to bilateral negotiations with the Palestinians after phase one implementation. Now, phase two means that you will see immediately no, you don't. The Israeli side is afraid that any permanent deal will become interim. What you give will cause another demands and will further on. And the Palestinian side is afraid that every interim will become permanent. You won't go on like this. And therefore, what you have to do in phase two, you have to create the sustainability of a deal and prepare it, which we know more or less what to do. And then in phase three, get to permanent status. What has happened on the roadmap is that there has been quite a lot of headway, mainly due to the disengagement plan of the government of Israel, where there's a lot of convergence of common interests in the short term. Israel understands, the body politic of Israel understands that getting out of most of the settlements in Gaza and east of the fence is an Israeli vested interest of Israel. And the settlement evacuation was an outcome of that. Both sides are interested in security, law and order. The slogan of the PA is one authority, one law, one gun. Economic development for the Palestinians is enormously important, and an orderly border regime which will make all this possible. So there's a common interest to work on these issues. What you have also today is a structure which comes along what Ambassador Jerijan calls adult supervision. You have James Wolfensohn and General Ward actually looking into how to create economic development, security, law and order, orderly border regime, and settlement evacuation. Israel did alone, but there's an understanding between Dov Weisglas and Condoleezza Rice on how to handle these issues. So we have a structure actually to put it ahead. These are the contradictory fears I spoke about. What to do? Develop a trilateral action plan for phase 1 implementation of the roadmap, which we are involved in looking at. After phase 1 implementation, go back to bilateral negotiation, and I would say collapse phase 2 and phase 3 into one. The Palestinians want it, and I believe the Israeli leadership, including Prime Minister Sharon, are close to go for that for a variety of reasons, which I can explain. Now, let me quickly look at the territorial deal for phase 2, which I don't know if I have to take you there, but anyhow, maybe we leave this out and I finish here and I open it for... I'm willing to go there if you want. Yeah, go. I have this here. In phase 2 would mean that there has to be a major another settlement withdrawal, evacuation, relocation, however you call it. And in 2003, a Palestinian political scientist called Khalil Shikaki has prepared those maps, which, in order not to show you what our maps are, which in the truth are very, very close to it, I'm using him. And, but this is how it would look. It means that you get out, you remove about 35 to 40 settlements with a population of 25 to 30,000 Israeli settlers. It's not an easy move, and we saw in the last disengagement how tough it was, but we also saw what a wonderful job the Israeli army and Israeli police did. And what you have is also that there is willingness from the settler community to move more and more into this direction. I know there will be demands for certain rights in the territories that will remain, which makes life difficult for diplomats, but may create a way further ahead. But the second stage of the roadmap could be seen there. Why to collapse it with the third roadmap? Because if you, it will be easier to take out more settlements if the settlers will know that what they're getting out is final. And where they're going to stay, they're going to stay. And where they're going out, they're going out. And the finality is you have in Jewish religion, you have the, it is better to have the certainty of difficult things than the uncertainty of things that may be ahead. And there's a search for certainty on the Israeli side, and there's definitely on the Palestinian side. Abu Mazen's position was always, let's look at how permanent status would look like. And what I can tell you is that if you look at permanent status understandings, there are 3 ways to solve problems. And we will have to have a combination of all the 3. One way is by substance, looking into the substance. How do you solve Jerusalem, refugees, territories, settlements, security, all these things? The second way of looking at it is looking to process. How do you agree on how to develop an agreed process that all sides can subscribe to? And I believe this is on some of the major issues possible. And there's a third way, which is less good, to have rules of engagement. But we can look at the issues that actually I believe the United States could come up with a structure that will permit negotiations to be led by both sides bilaterally, but within a given framework which make it very clear that there's substantial headway, and would help implement phase 1 and phase 2, but would get us very far in phase 3, if not completely to phase 3. The way to do it, and the challenge for United States policy, and I'm a supporter of, I believe the United States power is to lead an international coalition and not to do everything by itself. I believe that the way the Madrid conference and Wye River was done is that the government of the United States would, as James Baker has done before Madrid, conclude Israeli concessions ahead of time and then build a supportive architecture around it. And then after this has been done, actually go for the negotiations. It is not a small challenge, but it is doable. And what you have is the 5 scenarios ahead. We can return to violence. It happens like this. The instincts of both sides are to kill each other, and the emotions of both sides are killing each other. And you have to be very sustained in order to prevent it. This third Israeli unilateral action is possible in a state of almost violence. We have the beginning of coordinated unilateralism. There's a lot of things are possible when we apparently move unilaterally, but de facto this is fully coordinated. It has advantages. There could be an Israeli-Palestinian agreement on phase 2 of the roadmap, but I believe that we can move for the most optimistic one and to see, let's see how we create a framework for a permanent status. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yair. Dr. Hirschfeld is willing to take questions from the audience, so well, you could deal with them directly, Yair. Any questions or comments?
How do you see the separation wall playing a part in the peace process, towards or away? And your opinion on that?
Can I answer immediately? Can I answer immediately?
Yes.
I am a strong supporter of what we call the security barrier defense. I'll tell you a story about it. In 1999, then mayor of Haifa, Amram Mitzner, afterwards became the leader of the Labour Party, told me, Yair, we need a fence, not so much for security reasons, but you can quote me on that, to outfence the settlers. To give the settlers a sense that they're outside the reach. And then nobody looked at it. And then the Intifada broke out, and it became more and more the only game in town. And the truth is, when there was the terror act in Netanya, when 29 Jews were killed by reading the Haggadah in Netanya, the natural reaction of any Israeli was, let's have a fence to permit in order for out of self-defense. And then the government of Israel, who tends to be often irrational and greedy, developed a fence line which would take away 20% of the territory of the West Bank, which wasn't very intelligent. And the government of the United States came to Israel and told Israel, this is stupid, you're going to pay a high price for it. And our government said, you're friends, we don't have to listen to you. And then the Europeans went to the International Court in Hague. And when the Europeans went to the International Court in Hague, suddenly our government moved. There were other measures were moved. My organization was involved in doing quite a lot of things to move the fence to the position where it is. And then when the United States government saw Israel is moving on pressure from Europe and the International Court, the United States said, we can also exert pressure on you. The Americans know how to do that. I don't say that we should have pressure against us. But when I say that the fence that was put originally was outrageously stupid, if not worse than that. What I'm saying today is A, the fence is necessary. B, the fence, if you look today at the territory where the fence is, it takes 5% away from the West Bank territory where it is now. You have the Israeli government wants to take Ariel and Ma'ale Adumim additionally, which is another 3.5%, and Jerusalem another 1.5%, which gets you to 8.5%, 9.5%. So the Palestinian Authority has agreed on the principle of territorial exchange. So if it is a matter of 6%, 7%, up to 9%, and it won't be 9.5%, the fence is actually the beginning of a physical description of a two-state solution, which is not final. It will have to be negotiated. But it creates the basis in order for the settlers, in my language, to come home. It creates the basis for a clear partition between the two parts and the beginning of a real two-state solution. Now, it means also that the best is to negotiate that and make it happen.
Thanks.
There are two impediments that many people fear in negotiating and coming up with this, what we think is a realistic division and two states. And one is that the children in the Palestinian territories have been taught to hate Jews, and their little school books from the time that they're in kindergarten, they have, instead of Johnny likes to run, they have been taught that Johnny hates Jews. The other thing is that as we have seen with when the settlements were, the settlers had to leave, that the Hamas came out and said, aha, now we've won. This is something that you see there, the Israelis are weak and we've made them leave. And so to me, and to many people, these two things make us worry that the more we allow them to have, the more they'll want.
Okay, I'll tell you, and I'll try to be sophisticated, which I'm not. We tend to fall into traps that others put to us. If you look at the Hamas policy, and it was ably described by one of the members of the Baker Institute, the Hamas policy is actually to prevent a two-state solution and to take it all.
Right.
And the time is working in favor of the Hamas. We have today 180 settlements east of the fence, settlement to settlement outposts. We have today, you have a little bit about more than 5 million Jews. You have 4 million Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, and you've got 1 million Arabs in the Israeli territory. So we have today already a 5 to 5 million equation. So if the present situation stays, we are either, what we call the demographic balance is all for a unilateral state. And in the unilateral state, you have a situation where the Palestinian people are getting more and we are getting less. And there's the threat to us of Palestinian majority, which will try to dictate to us everything, and coming into existence of a South African situation. And you've got the Israeli minority, which is very powerful but threatened, and you will clash with each other. So the Hamas is trying to achieve the status quo in order to destroy the state of Israel. The Hamas is doing it either by political means or by terror. And what you're telling me in so many clear words, let's make the Hamas succeed. If they declare against, if they tell us to hate Jews, so let's make their strategy work. If they tell us they're happy, let's tell them that their strategy works. Only a people which wants to give up its own existence, only a people who has no understanding of basic strategies would go for such a proposal. The way to handle it, and I'm not sophisticated in answering that, I'm quite clear on my position. Only this was clear to us, so to me in 1892, 93, but this is clear to Sharon now. This is clear to many of the settlers movement today. There are two ways of getting to a two-state solution. One way is the tough way, and it's a very, very tough way. And it's very unpopular. It's unpopular with the international community. But one way is to say the way to a two-state solution are 5 stages. Stage 1 was Camp David. Stage 2 was Oslo. Stage 3 was the fence. Stage 4 is getting the settlers home behind the fence. And stage 5 will be to negotiate with the Palestinians afterwards. And if we get behind the fence, we have a strong two-state structure, and anything they will do, we will have the right to self-defense, and we actually can make it clear that we have a clear strategy to answer the destructive strategy of the Hamas. The better way is to negotiate, the way we're saying. And I believe this is possible. You know, the difference between boxing and judo is that in boxing you fight each other. And In judo, you use the power of the other side for yourself. So what you have to do is the Palestinian Authority, they don't like Hamas. They see Hamas as a threat to them. So we have a partner to isolate them. And we have ways to deal with them. So because of some emotional thinking, which I understand, and somebody's saying, okay, we won. Okay, let them say they won. We will show them they haven't won. Because of this kind of emotional input, I wouldn't give up a strategy that makes rationally sense.
How is the erosion of Abu Masan's power and the Palestinian Authority's power by the Hamas in the Gaza Strip going to affect the future negotiations?
I'd like to know myself. There are rules of the game. I tell you the possible bad news. Abu Mazen, I know him quite well, and he's a very impressive man. But I hope, and this I don't want, but I'm speaking on the record.
Don't, this is being broadcast on the whole.
If it gets too hot in the kitchen, Abu Mazen may walk out. And that's the big danger. As long as he doesn't walk out, and he's now in the United States and he'll get support from President Bush. As long as he doesn't walk out, he has to take the decision to move, but the odds are quite in his favor. I'll give you an example. There was the Hamas against the agreement with the PA, with Fatah, had these big demonstrations with weapons after we moved out. And then there was a lorry that with these rockets fell over, and 19 Palestinians were killed by their own lack of effectiveness or their stupidity. And the Hamas, of course, blamed Israel, which is the easiest to do, and sent 50 rockets into Israel. Now, we would have loved if the PA would have confronted the Hamas and gone against them. But they did something else which was quite positive. They said publicly, this wasn't Israel, this was the Hamas who did it. This was the Hamas who did it, and this was an accident of their doing, this wasn't Israel. And therefore, sending the rockets into Israel was a big mistake. 10 days later were elections, and the Hamas was punished. The Hamas was punished by the electorate. So in my sense, if we give the PA, if we develop a trilateral understanding how to move ahead on security issues, and we give the PA a sense, there are difficulties on the way, it's not so easy as I say, but if we give the Hamas, if we give the PA and Abu Mazen and the security cabinet a sense how you get into, how you deal with it, and what you do in practice. And what I'm actually saying is we have to learn a little bit from Giuliani, Mayor Giuliani in New York, who started to fight the little criminals before going at the big criminals. And they know how they go into a conflict and how they get out of the conflict. And there's some kind of thinking how this is done. This is not done under terrible pressure, but this is done in the time they can do it. I think we have a big, big chance of success.
I appreciate your optimism. I wish I could be so optimistic. I'll tell you a quick story. A friend of mine who is a reporter in Israel told me shortly after Abbas became president. He went to Makaka, and there were some his security guards standing around Arafat's gravesite, smoking cigarettes. And he went over to them. They smoked a cigarette together, and they were talking. He said, "So what are you going to do if Abu Mazen gives up the right of return in order to create the state?" And this was the officer in charge of all the other guards there. He said, "I'll kill him." If Abu Mazen cannot have the support of his own security guards, how can he how can he create any kind of security in this country?
If you want from me a guarantee, a check that everything will be fine, you won't get it. I can tell you a lot of more of difficulties there are. I can tell you all the frustrations which they have and we have. Basically, my answer is very simple. If there's a will, there's a way. Now, if there's a will, there's a way. You have to think a lot about it, and it's not so easy to carry it out. But you have to have what I call sequencing. You have to have an ongoing movement of some kind of success creation. And if I would be to tell you, if I'm an Israeli, I had a shouting match with Rob Malley in August or September 2000 on what the United States wanted to say about the right of return on the refugees. Rob Malley tells me it had an impact on the American thinking. So I'm very clear about that from an Israeli point of view. If I would be a Palestinian, I wouldn't give up the right of return top front. If we are asking from the Palestinians to give up the right of return top front without knowing what they're getting in return and what there is in substance to find a comprehensive and fair solution of the refugee issue, where the Palestinians, refugees, have a choice to make, which will take care of our interests, I wouldn't do it. So the question is, can you create the sequencing to go there? What I can tell you is that, for instance, the Palestinian NGO called Panorama, which is led by a man called Riyad al-Malki, is going from one refugee camp to the other, and is explaining the 5 Clinton versions of there's a Clinton proposal of December 2000, the 5 options the Palestinian refugees would have according to the Clinton proposals. And most of the refugees are saying they are told why the right of return to Israel is a disaster for them, for us too, but for them. He's doing that. Now, his report is very interesting. His report may make you more pessimistic again. His report is that the refugees are saying this is fine not to return to Israel, and the difficulty is coming from the political echelons. So the political echelons are still very much afraid. I'm speaking a lot to the political echelons, and they're telling me, we went to the refugee camp and we dare today something like this. They're afraid of them. So we will have to prepare the ground on the bottom, from a bottom-up approach.
That could be the last question, unfortunately.
If there's a Palestinian state and you have the freedom of movement, one, how do you think you would connect the territories? And two, what's the best way to give freedom of movement without threatening the security of Israelis?
Yeah, James Wolfram, on the second one, James Wolfram is working on that. And my little organization is working on these practical issues. There are many ways in thinking how to do it. I don't want to fatigue you, but I'll give you on movement. I'll give you one short story to give you an idea. You have in Sheikh Hussein Bridge between Jordan and Israel. There is $1.5 billion trade going from Irbit and other places in Jordan to Haifa, and from Haifa to United States via the QIZs, the Qualified Industrial Zones. There's $1.5 billion going through Sheikh Hussein Bridge with one scanner. You've got in Karni, on the Israeli-Palestinian cross-border line, you have got 8 scanners, and almost nothing goes through there. And you ask, for heaven's sake, why? Why? Because the Israelis love the Jordanians, hate the Palestinians? It's not the real answer. The answer is that there are 2 conditions which are happening in Sheikh Hussein, which don't exist in Karni. Condition number 1, there is serious the businesses in Irbit are doing a pre-security checking. And there's a sterile corridor, a security corridor from Irbit to Sheikh Hussein. That doesn't exist in Karni. And the second condition is that there's a lot of cooperation between Israeli and Jordanian intelligence. What we are trying to do, now, the same exists, only the same exists. There's a Palestinian in Bethlehem who is exporting marble from Bethlehem to Shanghai. He's building big marble houses in Shanghai. And they're exporting 35 lorries a day of marble, marble via similar pre-security checking on a back-to-back basis to Haifa and out. And it works. So what we have to establish with the Palestinians to do that. There are a variety of reasons why it doesn't work so far. But we're working on it. Now, this is on the first question. When freedom of movement, you have to do more things than that. But this is the basic. Now, the second, on how will be it in permanent status. The RAND Corporation is preparing a study for a 10-year, there's a wonderful book published by them, How to Establish a Successful State. And they are establishing what they call an arc, where you'll have a railway, which they are comparing with the San Francisco Bay, which we'll have a railway which actually will go from Haifa to Jenin, from Jenin to Hebron, and south of Hebron to Gaza. And there can be many arrangements for such a railway and road to do it. And now I would not, if I would be Israeli decision maker, which I'm not, I would not give any sovereignty rights to the Palestinians on that. But you have right of passage. And there will be right of passage, will be mutual rights of passage. So it is something that can be handled.
Hirschfeld, thank you very much. Please accept this token of our appreciation. This is for your wife, not you. And you join me in thanking you for an excellent presentation. Thank you very much.
We've, by the way, been overwhelmed, my wife and I, overwhelmed with Houstonian hospitality, and very moved and very grateful for it. Thank you.